What on earth is latent power supposed to be? Oh, is that what you call the thing where magical talking trees are never able to show up on time? Latent power? No, Gemma, it's a skill! A skill that you put on my armor! Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, Monster Hunter Wilds is full of a bunch of very interesting skills that can have a massive impact on your moment-to-moment gameplay, but as is a classic part of the series that has existed since the beginning, quite a few of these skill descriptions are incredibly vague. One that has been vague in every single iteration of the series has been specifically latent power. This is notable and special for the fact that it does actually tell you what it does in theory, and with specific numbers for the effect as well, but it doesn't tell you how to activate the buff, or how long it stays active, or anything like that in the slightest. And the thing is, it changes between every game as well, which is just hilarious, honestly. And of course, the skill gets tested in every game, slightly different every time, but today we're going to talk about how this skill works in Monster Hunter Wilds in general. We're going to talk about how good or bad it is in comparison to other offensive skills, then we'll go over how it works in with the Rey Dau set bonus as well. To preface this conversation as well, the main reason that we are doing this right now is that Josh has told me that we are getting some form or sort of route to just more efficient sources of latent power in the future, so while this skill isn't used much currently, it's good to really know how it works properly and to understand how good it is so we can understand how good it could be when more gear is added. First things first, how does latent power function? Well, of course, after meeting certain conditions, you get a buff for an undefined amount of time. This buff, when activated, is up to 50% affinity and 50% reduced stamina depletion, which is actually quite hefty, as long as you have, all 5 ranks of the skill. Especially for weapons like bow and dual blades that consume a lot of stamina, that might actually sound like it's a really good thing. But there is a bit of a caveat here, which is that the stamina use reduction cannot go past 50%, so this skill does not stack past the value that you would get from Constitution, or Marathon Runner, or the Black Belt food skill. It stacks with those sources if you only have level 1 or 2 of latent power, but you can never go past a total of 50% reduced stamina usage overall. So basically, if you use latent power with weapons that would normally want stamina management skills, you are sort of incentivized to not run any other form of stamina management, which means gameplay would feel really off whenever the skill is inactive, but really smooth while it is active. And that is the main issue with the skill, is that while the effect itself is quite strong as well, just in general, 50% affinity is incredible, the problem is the lack of consistency. With that said, now let's talk about the timers and the activation conditions. These conditions are just a menace to actually work out. Thankfully, they are generally similar from game to game, even if there are slight changes. As far as activating it then, there are 2 contributing factors in Monster Hunter Wilds: time or damage taken. If you don't take any damage at all, then the skill will activate after you spend 2 minutes in the presence of a large monster. Specifically, you just have to be in the same zone as a large monster for that duration. Like the numbered areas that you can see on your map, you just need to be somewhat near it. This is the same sort of radius that knows to give you frenzy when you have the Gore magala set bonus, so think of it sort of like that. You don't need to be in combat, but you do need to be close to them. That said, this applies automatically in the training room, as the barrel cart counts as a large monster, and the training room is a singular zone, so that makes it really easy to test the specific timer by just entering the training room with latent power equipment and seeing how long it takes to activate, which is 2 minutes, 120 seconds. So 2 minutes after walking up to a large monster and sticking around it, whether in combat or not, the skill will activate no matter what. The other way to trigger the skill activation is by taking damage. Specifically, taking right around 133 damage will trigger the effect from my testing. I tested it with about 8 different defense numbers with various buffs and the consumables and effects active. I took note of how much damage I took from the max damage amped training dummy, translated the pixels to health numbers, and then multiplied by the amount of hits that it took to trigger latent power, which means for each of these, the actual number is somewhere between the range of numbers that I've written down here. As for the first number example, it activated on the 7th hit, so the condition must be somewhere between hit 6 and hit 7. And then the final version, I just whipped out Corrupted Mantle and stood there for a bit. Again, I counted the pixels of the first tick of damage to work out the actual health lost per tick, and it takes 44 ticks for corrupted mantle alone to activate this buff, at least in my current setup. That puts the most precise that I've actually got it, which is that the amount to activate the skill must be higher than 130.8 health lost, but it also must be lower than 134, with some of my tests activating it right around the 132.5 marker specifically, though that's getting incredibly too precise really, as you won't be counting amounts of damage taken to that precision actively on a quest. It's enough to know that you need to take, in total, around 88% of a meal buff boosted health bar in damage to activate the effect purely through damage, and I'll just call it 135 for the sake of a reference point for the rest of the video. Once you have taken that amount of damage, no matter how long it takes you to do it, doesn't matter if you heal in the middle as well, and even if you are never in the presence of a large monster, this skill will then activate. From this point, common sense might lead you to believe that taking damage essentially takes time off the timer then, right? Like surely it would make sense that if 135 health is the equivalent of 120 seconds of waiting, then if you take 67.5 damage, which is half of the threshold, that should then take half of the timer off the activation as well, and that should make it activate quicker through time. Well, if that was the way it worked, the skill would be much more comparable to something like Counter-Strike, where it's good in general but then scales to being better and better the more you get hit, but that's not quite how latent power works. Latent power's activation conditions are all totally separate from each other. This means even if you take damage, unless you reach up to that specific 135 or so damage threshold, it will not make latent power activate any sooner. On the other hand, if you spend 100 seconds near a large monster so you almost trigger it through time, then you instantly take 120 damage, you still won't activate latent power early until you either hit the 2-minute mark or hit the damage taken threshold. They function entirely independent of each other. I've also heard people say that there is a third activation condition, which is just, quest timer related whether you are near a large monster or not, but I did test that by putting on latent power and launching a quest and just standing there for ages, and it never activated without either of the other two conditions. As well, in Rise and Sunbreak, they added an extra component where the 2-minute timer could be reduced by hitting the monster and dealing damage, which makes a lot of sense. That sounds like a really good mechanical change to the skill. It rewarded aggression with higher uptime, and that functionality is completely gone in Wilds. That's not a thing in Monster Hunter Wilds. It was in Rise and Sunbreak. It isn't for latent power right now. There are two ways right now to activate latent power, and it's either waiting 2 minutes while in the presence of a large monster, or taking around 133 damage, and these methods do not overlap or help each other in the slightest. Once you activate the effect, it will then stay active for 2 minutes by default, so the exact same amount of time it takes to activate it just sort of passively. This means, as a default, if we just go by the time passing method, this skill's active time is equal to its inactive time, its activation time, which means that it should be active exactly 50% of the time. 50% uptime. If you ever manage to trigger it with damage taken, that percentage would go up, and so this is a skill that directly scales upwards the worse that you are at dodging a monster's attacks, similar to Counter-Strike for weapons that can't trigger Counter-Strike through things like an offset. Against the lower half of difficulty of the monster roster in the game, if you are in endgame gear, you probably won't activate the effect through damage taken unless you are just letting yourself get hit by every attack the monster does, never actually even trying to dodge. Against higher tier tempered monsters, this can be activated in a good 3, 4, 5 hits depending on what attacks they are. So while it isn't ideal, and I don't think you should purposefully tank your resources and supplies by purposefully taking damage to activate the skill early, this secondary source of activation will just happen sometimes. Not often, ideally of course, because you don't want to get hit, but it will happen. The next major consideration for this is the Rey Dau set bonus, Rey Dau's voltage, and this increases the actual duration of the active buff effect on latent power. So the activation conditions don't change, but the duration of the buff does, which changes the uptime of the skill overall. The 2 set bonus extends the duration from 2 minutes up to 2.5 minutes, so an extra 30 seconds. That's a 25% duration increase on top of the base skill. The 4 set bonus bumps it up to 3.5 minutes instead, which is much better. This is an extra 1.5 minutes over the base skill effect, which is a 75% duration increase. With 3.5 minutes of active time and a 2-minute activation timer before that. That then puts this at 2 minutes off, 3.5 minutes on, which is right around 60% overall uptime instead of the 50% uptime it is without the set bonus. So this does actually make it a much more favorable skill, by which I mean to say the set bonus is solid if you're going to be wanting to use latent power anyways. Without the set bonus, at an uptime of 50%, you'd see an averaged gain of 25% affinity and 25% stamina use reduction if you have latent power at level 5, which is probably best compared to weakness exploit level 5, which is 30% affinity always if you're hitting a weak spot on the monster, with an extra 20% bonus affinity against wounds. So while this may sound a bit worse on the surface, consider that wounds only happen sometimes, and that some builds or playstyles just don't want to hit weakness exploit body parts all the time. Pierce builds will pierce through and hit multiple different body parts. Element builds sometimes focus on body parts that have lower raw attack hit zones as well, and so there definitely is a place for skills that are less efficient than weakness exploit for affinity gain, but don't require weak parts. On which note, with the 4-set bonus, which is 60% uptime instead, you go up to an average value of 30% affinity and 30% stamina use reduction, which is genuinely quite solid for 5 ranks of a skill. As for other positive things that are in favor of latent power, the stamina use reduction component makes it an incredible skill for weapons that use lots of stamina, especially for weapons that struggle to use maximum might as a result, because maximum might is an affinity-based skill that requires you to be careful with your stamina management, whereas latent power is an affinity-based skill that gives you more freedom and comfort with your stamina. So they are sort of opposites in that sense. In any build where you are avoiding using maximum might, latent power is suddenly a skill that is worth some genuine consideration. But another thing to think about there too, which is sort of contradictory to what I just said, is that the stamina use reduction from latent power, while active, makes it easier to keep high uptime on maximum might. So if you are using them together, they do sort of work, but then you're putting a lot into a sort of conditional affinity. Another positive here is that it works incredibly well with other certain skills too, a great example being heroics, actually. Heroics is most often used by speedrunners for speedrun purposes because 5 ranks of heroics gives you a massive percentage damage boost of 30% attack when you are under 35% health, and these speedruns often self-damage themselves before hunting to activate the effect. If you have 150 max health, you would then have to take over 100 damage to trigger heroics anyways, and at that point it's not that much more of an ask to just self-damage yourself an extra 30 points or so to prime yourself to activate latent power right at the start of the actual hunt, activating it with one final hit taken before you actually begin. So yes, it is definitely overly complex, but I do think there is synergy potential for speedruns specifically, using heroics and latent power together and activating both of these buffs just as the actual hunt is right about to begin, and then just being an absolutely ridiculously powerful beast for the latent power duration, especially as most monsters in the game are currently killable by speedrunners within a 3-minute 30-second duration of Rey Dau 4-set bonus with latent power. So while I can see why speedrunners wouldn't want to bother with it, as it's a whole lot of setup for every single run where so many things could go wrong, and it just creates so much extra inconsistency and extra time required, but it does have to be mentioned that there is synergy potential between those skills. The final positive then is that the skill is simply better to use the worse you are at avoiding monster attacks. If you just want to hunt with your brain sort of off, you never really dodge anything, you tank every hit just because you can and then get back up and get back in there, then latent power suddenly becomes much more reliable. And so I genuinely think this skill is solid for either newer players who are learning the game, or for more experienced people who just, don't put that much effort into dodging, which is, a way of playing the game. Ironically, however, it is also one of the skills least used by newer players because they have no idea what it does or how to activate it because of the terribly vague skill description. Again, then now let's move on to the two main proper negatives of the skill, which are both simply based around inconsistency. When putting together Monster Hunter builds, the easy part is just working out the numbers that skills have, finding the higher numbers, sticking those skills together, but the real complexity comes when you start thinking about realistic in-game situations. Latent power, by design, works in very large ebbs and flows. It has a large period of downtime and then a large period of uptime with a very powerful effect, and it goes back and forth between these. If the skill was purely an attack increase as an example, that would actually be fine. It would be much better and much easier to work around, because periodic attack increases are great. You don't have to think about them, they just happen when they happen. It's very easy to use. The problem is that this is a periodic increase in affinity and stamina management. The stamina part is an issue because the weapons that want stamina management skills want to have those all the time. They don't just want it sometimes, they don't just want it 50% of the hunt, you want it always. And so you'd either end up overdoing it and having stamina management outside of your latent power, which is then wasted when latent power activates, or you would go the other way and just have really awkward gameplay in between the actual latent power windows. So in my opinion, the stamina part of the skill is just not great because it's not reliable. As for the affinity, it's a very similar issue when putting your build together. There are a few active choices that must be made so you decide your damage focus. Element scales with different things than raw attack does, and the value of affinity and crit boost and stuff like that is variable depending on how much you can get in your set. If you have high affinity, high crit chance, then the value of something like critical boost as a weapon skill is much higher than if you had low affinity, and vice versa. If you have the ability to take crit boost as a weapon skill, then taking affinity from your armor skills becomes much better in general. And right now in Wilds, affinity is incredibly high value within our current spread of skills and such, and people are always aiming for very high affinity in their meta builds with crit boost in them as well. And it's all well and good to say that on average the skill is worth 25% affinity, which isn't bad at all, or as high as 30% affinity with the 4-set bonus included, but because affinity has a cap to its usefulness, there is more to the conversation. Because if you have more than 100% affinity at any point during a hunt, it's being wasted. 100% is 100%. It is a guarantee, so having more than that does nothing, which means that you need to purposefully build in a way where you will never go above 100% affinity, because if you do, you would simply get more value after dropping some of that affinity off and getting more attack somewhere in your build instead. With latent power being a whopping 50% affinity when active, but a conditional activation, this means when using this skill at full ranks, you never want to have more than 50% affinity coming from other sources. And the main issue that causes is it means when latent power isn't active, you will have at most 50% affinity, so 2 minutes of 50% crit chance in between activations, and this completely messes up all the damage calculations and which skills are better than the others, because during that 2-minute period, your critical boost levels are doing much less for you than they are when latent power is active. And so there are some situations where you get more damage out of a different weapon skill when latent power is inactive than you would when it's active. You could argue for maybe solving this by having 2 of the same exact weapon with different decorations slotted in, and then just swapping between them depending on whether latent power is active or not. And while you could do that, that is just a really good way to overcomplicate the hell out of hunting. And the time that you spend calling your seikret and then swapping weapons multiple times through a hunt is just a very large negative to that concept as well. This doesn't necessarily make latent power bad in itself, but it makes it much more complex to build around than most other affinity skills in the game, maybe all other skills. It makes it way more conditional than the other affinity skills in general, and the thing is, there's an extra layer of inconsistency to this, which is specific hunt times. We went over the average uptime for latent power being 50% without the set bonus and around 60% with the 4-set bonus, and while this would be true across a really long hunt, a really long quest timer where all this stuff has time to average out, the truth is, in Wilds, a lot of hunts with meta builds, or even somewhat close to meta builds, are sub 5 minutes long, and then even off meta or playing for shenanigans instead of raw efficiency, you go up to like 10 minutes on average, even for the higher HP monsters, excluding like Zoshia, who can obviously be done quite quick, but most average hunts are probably longer than anything else in the game. And even then, that is still just relatively speaking longer. With the way that latent power works, if your hunt takes 2 minutes and 30 seconds total, the first 2 minutes would have been spent as the activation timer for latent power, which means that you only actually got 30 seconds of value from latent power before the hunt just ended while you still had the buff, which then would bring its uptime for that quest down to like 20%. It makes it an absolutely awful skill if that happens. Even if you had the hunt be 3.5 minutes total, that's 2 minutes of time to activate the skill, then 90 seconds of it being active, which is a bit more than a 43% uptime. Point being, the realistic uptime of this skill, especially in Wilds, depends on the exact quest completion timer. If the quest ends in the middle of a latent power buff period, your uptime will end up lower than if the quest were to end during the downtime in between. between. And the shorter a quest is, the larger a discrepancy that makes. So with the short hunt times currently in wilds, this means that on some hunts, latent power will be at its full expected values and actually be worth quite a bit. On some hunts, it might actually be worth more than what we've averaged out here. It'll turn out to be much more valuable and actually be very good, but on other hunts, you'll just get like half the expected value because of an overlap of specific timers like this. For example, here is a tempered Congalala with a 3-minute 37-second total quest timer. 1 minute and 31 seconds into the quest timer was when I activated latent power from just tanking hits from Congalala purposely, and then it stays active until the quest is over. So in this situation, it's 1 minute and 31 seconds to activate the buff, then 2 minutes and 6 seconds of uptime, which puts it just above 60% uptime in that quest due to me activating it through taking damage early and making it activate before the natural timer. Similarly, I did purposefully do the exact same thing and got hit a bunch by a tempered duna and activated latent power only 1 minute into the quest timer on a quest that was 5 minutes and 47 seconds long total. This means 1 minute of downtime right at the beginning, then 3.5 minutes of uptime because I'm also using the Rey Dau 4-set bonus, then 1 minute and 15 seconds of downtime on the back end of the quest. And despite me cutting the standard activation time in half by taking the damage early on at the beginning, this still means over the entire hunt, my latent power uptime was again right around 60%, which is the theoretical average uptime even without activating it early when using the 4-set bonus, which I am, because the hunt had 1 minute of downtime at the beginning, but then 1 minute and a little bit more of downtime during the final minute of hunting as well, because it continued past the end of the latent power window. All of that to say, there are numbers you can try to attribute to this skill, but due to the way that it works and the current average hunt duration in wilds, it's just a really inconsistent skill from hunt to hunt. Some hunts it will be a major contributor to your overall damage, some it won't be barely anything, and that's based on so many different factors too, which is why I've been talking so much about this skill instead of just giving you straight numbers, because there's just so much more to it than that. So compare this to something like Agitator, which also has an affinity boosting component and isn't permanently active, but Agitator is based on the monster's enrage cycle, and when a monster enrages is based on its health percentage. So unlike how latent power works, the more damage you do to a monster, the better Agitator gets. Aside from specifically Guardian monsters, which are a bit funky with enrages, and this is closer to what latent power was doing in Rise and Sunbreak, but doesn't do anymore in Wilds. Then compare it to the Gore Magala 2-set bonus, with antivirus attached as well, of course. That's 25% affinity when active. Most players can clear the frenzy debuff in active combat in about 15 seconds or so, I'd say, and then the buff that follows lasts for 60 seconds. So generally, I count this as around 80% uptime. The second that you lose the buff, you gain frenzy again, so the cycle repeats on a very short timer because you can get the buff active very quickly once again. Because of how short the downtime is in between the activations of this buff, even if the quest ends quickly or ends early or it ends during the buff duration, the relative uptime loss is much less impactful than something like latent power, where there is again up to 2 minutes of downtime in between. So to round that up, the main issue really is the fact that latent power's buff gives you affinity, which is an important stat, and it has a usefulness cap. And it also gives you stamina management, which is an important stat for some weapons that also has a usefulness cap. But then it has very, very long periods of downtime where you won't be able to make use of those effects, and the amount of these things it gives is great. 50% unconditional affinity would be an incredible use of a skill, but having these stats jump up and down so significantly every 2 minutes because of the way that the buff works is just a nightmare to try and build around. That being said, with the set bonus, the skill gets much better and much more comparable to other affinity skills that have activation conditions, and at that point it genuinely is not a bad skill. It's not necessarily the best of the bunch, which is why people don't really use it that much, but it's not a bad skill either. It just isn't quite as good as other offensive skills, especially the other affinity options that just have a bit more consistency. That said, it is at a specific point right now here where if we were to get a new source of equipment that has latent power, and if that had a lot of slots on it for good decorations, or if it had the right supporting skills on it in general, or anything like that really, latent power absolutely could become a meta skill. It just isn't quite there at the moment. That just about does it for today then, everyone. Everything that you need to know about latent power as a skill, how it works, and all of the things that affects it. Hopefully this helps you out in understanding one of the most vague skills in the series as a whole, and hopefully whatever new source of this skill that Josh has told me we are going to get into at some point is actually good enough to make the difference here, as I would love to have latent power be a genuinely meta skill, even for like a month or two, just to really shake things up and change regular gameplay loops. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.